Okay, hello YouTube. Today I'm going to be talking about an opening called the Cambridge Springs. This is by a viewer request who wanted to see a video on the Cambridge Springs defense. So if you like content like this and you want to see more content like this, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. So anyways, the Cambridge Springs happens after d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, and then there's two ways to actually get to the Cambridge Springs defense. I would say kind of the most popular way on the lower levels, where I think the Cambridge Springs is a very popular opening, is the move knight on b to d7, and this kind of contains a little bit of poison to it. There's a little bit of a trap here. And the other way is to just play c6, just to get to the traditional setup, and then bring that knight to d7, and then bring this queen to a5, and we have the beginnings of what begins the Cambridge Springs. So what is the Cambridge Springs? Why do amateurs really love this opening? And what do I think about the theory of the Cambridge Springs in general as like a general opening? Well, the Cambridge Springs was first played by none other than Emanuel Lasker in 1892. And of course, Emanuel Lasker himself had a pretty decent result with that first game. Now, the Cambridge Springs got its name not from 1892, it got its name from an international tournament that was played in 1904 in Cambridge Springs. It was named after the city, it was named after Cambridge Springs. And in that tournament, the Cambridge Springs defense was played 3 times, and it actually scored pretty abysmally. It scored 1/2 point out of 3. And actually throughout the Cambridge Springs history, as far as an opening goes, at the highest levels, the Cambridge Springs has never really scored particularly well. It has been an opening that has been a good weapon in the hands of a very few select players. Players like Garry Kasparov have played it, players like Magnus Carlsen have played it, and of course, famously Alexander Alekhine played it against Capablanca in the World Championship match. But of course, Alexander Alekhine mostly played main lines of the QGD in that World Championship match, and one of the reasons for that is because Capablanca in one of their games dismantled his Cambridge Springs in what's called the Cambridge Springs Immortal, where Capablanca just completely destroyed Alexander Alekhine's Cambridge Springs. So, what's going on here? Why are people playing Queen a5 and Bishop b4? Well, as you can imagine, Lasker was the first person to play this. And a lot of Lasker's opening revolved kind of around the same concept, which is Lasker himself was a very good tactician. He almost never missed anything. He was very good at calculating. And he was very good at those technical aspects of chess. So he was very good at middle games and he was very good at end games. So one of the things that he liked to do in his games is he liked to solve the biggest problem of the opening immediately. Now, in the QGD, in the Queen's Gambit Declined, the biggest problem of the opening is actually just the fact that we have less space and the fact that we sometimes have difficulty finishing our development or getting all of our pieces out. And one of the ways that you can solve this problem is just by very crudely getting rid of some minor pieces and getting rid of them as quickly as possible. So Lasker was also famous, of course, for the Lasker variation in the Queen's Gambit Declined, and in that variation the bishop went to e7 as it traditionally does, but then Lasker would employ an early knight to e4 to trade off this dark squared bishop for the bishop. So you can see a common theme here. Lasker was trying to dump this dark squared bishop. And the reason he was trying to dump it was because the biggest problem in the Queen's Gambit Declined is simply that black has less space. And because black has less space, Lasker wanted to just get some pieces off the board so that he could maneuver his pieces behind these 3 ranks. Because he was going to have to maneuver these 3 pieces behind these 3 ranks for an extended period of time, especially after trading off the dark squared bishop, because the dark squared bishop is essentially black's best piece. If you look at the pawn structure in the middle of the board, all of these pawns are on light squares, which means that you have a well-defined good bishop and a well-defined bad bishop. So the Cambridge Springs on a very fundamental level is a positional error. You're trading off your good bishop for something, but objectively it's your best minor piece. But it's a fundamental error that solves the biggest problem in the position, which is that you have too many pieces and not enough space to move them around. So that's why the Cambridge Springs has been used by a select number of players, usually players with excellent in-game technique and excellent technical skills, that are able to just basically dump this minor piece and say, hey, you can't beat me, and if you try, I might end up beating you. And that's why it's been a favorite of players like Magnus Carlsen and players like Garry Kasparov. Now, on the lower levels, the reason that this is very popular is because there's a lot of tricks in the early opening. So one of the tricks in the early opening is after we employ the move order, for example, knight on b to d7, there's actually a very sneaky trap called the elephant trap, or I think it's the elephant trap, where basically the idea is that you trick white into thinking that he can take this pawn on d5 when he can't. So that's one of these early tricks. So then after cd5, ed5, and then say knight d5, knight d5, and then bishop captures queen, this is actually a mistake because bishop b4 puts the king in check, and only the queen can block. And because only the queen can block, after you capture and the king captures and you capture on d8, you've suddenly just won a piece. You have 3 minor pieces versus 2. So this is really appealing to beginners because, hey, we've got this trap. Another thing that we do when we play this move, queen a5, so just when we get the queen out to a5, one of the things that you'll notice, other than all the positional stuff I've pointed out, is that tactically, there can be an issue here with this bishop on g5. Now that comes into play even in the main lines of the Cambridge Springs. So for example, knight d2, and then we're going to just play bishop to b4. Now if they play a normal looking development move, for example, if they bring this bishop to d3, they might not notice that they have some very serious problems on g5. So for example, if they were to play something like, say, queen g2, queen c2, and then we were to castle, they could play the question mark bishop d3, and then when we take here, we're winning a whole piece. So this is another cute little trick, is we're hitting the bishop on d3, we're hitting the bishop on g5, and taking on f6 doesn't seem to solve our problems, because even after we take on f6, we're going to be taking on d3, and now we're attacking the queen, and we're attacking the bishop, and again, black is going to end up an entire piece. Another thing is that even though this pin with bishop to b4 and queen a5 is very crude, if white doesn't start responding with a move like knight d2 to counter this, the so-called anti-Tartakower, the anti-Cambridge Springs is what they called it back when Capablanca kind of was introducing this type of idea. But knight d2 has been a pretty common move throughout the history of the Cambridge Springs. If they don't do something like that, if they just kind of, let's just say, hang out, if they just play like bishop e2 and just hang out, we can actually utilize this pin. We can play bishop to b4, we're creating this pin, we're putting this pressure, and it is very crude pressure. But they do have to do something to meet it, because we are just threatening to take this pawn. So now even if they play rook c1, knight e4, we're putting pressure here and here, and this is, you can see this is the reason we're playing knight d2. It's to control for this knight e4 idea, is we're hitting the bishop on g5, we're hitting the knight on c3, and of course now white's wishing that knight were back on d2. And then even if we play here, we can simply win this pawn on a2. We can actually take it right away. And one of the reasons we're getting away with this, with our queen so far off sides, is because we're simply going to exchange on c3 now and exchange away our pesky queen and exchange away the rest of the pieces, and we're going to end up with pawn. Everything comes off the board. So for example, castles, bishop c3, bc3 is kind of forced, queen c2, rook c2, knight g5, knight takes g5, we can exchange some more stuff, dc4, bishop c4, king e7. Is advantage black. Black has an extra pawn. And of course, he's still got this development problem to solve, and he's got less space, and this is just something that we deal with when you're playing the Cambridge Springs. But in this position, he's up a pawn, and he should have there's no reason he can't go on to win. So on the professional level, what makes the Cambridge Springs so difficult, and on the master level and on the grandmaster level, is that if your opponent doesn't fall for any of these cool little traps, you've basically given up, in most cases, you may have given up your best piece, or you're going to end up suffering with like a lot less space. So I'll give you an example of a common Cambridge Springs variation that gets played on the top level. So for instance, if they play knight d2, I was always a big fan, and other players have been a big fan of taking on c4 immediately. This is actually one of the things that when I was younger, I actually was attracted to the Cambridge Springs briefly, because I saw this variation with d takes c4. And what amazed me about this variation with d takes c4, and of course I saw Kasparov play games where he played dc4, is we're putting immediate pressure on this hanging bishop on g5, and white is forced to play bishop f6, so we get to exchange a pair of pieces, and I get to keep my bishop pair, and I like my bishop pair. So I thought, hey, this is really cool. But the downside is we traded one disadvantage for another disadvantage. So the one disadvantage that we had was that we had too many pieces and not enough places to move them. And yeah, we've gotten rid of some pieces, and we got rid of positionally a very good piece. We got rid of a bishop for a knight, and now we have a bishop pair. And we got to keep our good bishop. We still have our good bishop. So on that positional level, we're doing okay. But wow, did we just give up a whole bunch of space with d captures c4. And after knight c4, queen c7, we're very, very cramped back here. And we're going to be suffering for a very long time. And so this is something that gets played, though. Actually, this was played recently between Grischuk and Carlsen, just to give you an idea of how this game went. It went rook c1, bishop e7, g3, castles, rook d8, bishop d7. As you can see, Carlsen's just maneuvering his pieces behind these three ranks. And you can see if we add a fourth piece in here, like if you add another knight or if you add another bishop, you really just you run out of room. And that's why it's really important in the Cambridge Springs that you have to get rid of your one piece, your one minor piece. And that's really the idea behind the Cambridge Springs, is we're going to dump this one minor piece, and that way we're going to be able to maneuver behind these lines without getting so cramped that the pieces are stepping on each other and we end up losing one of them. So rook fd1, bishop e8, Carlsen manages to get his rook on an open file, and he manages to trade another pair of pieces. And he just bids for space, plays c5, bids for freedom, and now his two bishops will have a chance to move. And you can see that even with all of Carlsen's skills, he's very pleased just to get to an endgame that is essentially totally equal and still not completely risk-free. He had to avoid these little ideas, and then once the queens get exchanged, he actually ends up down a pawn. And he has to save this position down a pawn, which he does. He's got the technique to do it. And this is the technical aspect of the Cambridge Springs. Is you'll notice that this opening will get employed by players with a really high level of technical skill. Players that aren't afraid to get in positions like this, where they're forced to hold these very difficult technical positions. And guys like Magnus Carlsen can do that. Guys like Garry Kasparov could do that. And of course, the guy that this opening was really almost built for was Emanuel Lasker. And the fact that Alexander Alekhine could play this opening and even win games with it just is a testament to how good his technical skill was. So this game between, this is actually following the game between Grischuk and Carlsen. And Carlsen just continued playing hyper-accurate moves. And eventually the game just ended in perpetual check. And this was Grischuk versus Carlsen in Paris in 2017. So again, to give you like a further concept of like the history of this opening, I'm going to show you a couple of the early games in this opening so you can really get a feel for what's going on. So this is the earliest game that was played in this position. This was Hodges versus Emanuel Lasker, and that game immediately continued bishop f6, and then Lasker continued with the move gf6. a3, dc4, bishop c4, Lasker played queen h5. Now this is a common theme you're going to see with some of these Cambridge Springs games, is Lasker, again, he had no problem just kind of maneuvering his pieces behind these lines. He's got it down to three minor pieces, so he should have enough room to maneuver without being too terribly cramped. And that's exactly what he did, and he managed to actually outplay his opponent, and he eventually turned this into a win. But look at this monumental amount of third rank play. He has no problem just hanging out and playing on the third rank with every confidence that he'll be able to outplay his opponent. On a traditional level, White's position is actually quite good compared to Black's. White has the better bishop for his pawn structure. The only downside in White's position is that he doesn't have the bishop pair. Black has the doubled pawns, and black has less space. So really, if white was a better player, he would be able to do to Lasker what Capablanca was able to do to Alekhine in their match in the Cambridge Springs Immortal. But Hodgson he wasn't as skilled as Lasker was. So Lasker was able to maneuver his pieces to good squares, was able to make exchanges, and was able to make all of the right positional and strategic choices to improve his pieces. One of the things that separates world champions and super grandmasters from the rest of us is they're really good at the technical aspects of chess, and they're very good at always knowing how to improve their position in any situation. A lot of us will get to a position where we hit a brick wall and we don't know how to improve our position anymore, and then we start making mistakes. World champions and super grandmasters and guys on that level, what they do is they hit that wall and then they find some magical way to keep improving. And that's what you see with Lasker's play, and that's what you see in this game, is you just see Lasker's amazing ability to play the middle game, to continue to improve his pieces, to get his pieces to better squares than his opponent. And he just outplayed his opponent, and he eventually won the game with black. So you can kind of see the theme that I'm going with here, is the Cambridge Springs is an opening that solves this major opening problem. But at the same time, it is positionally a very, very difficult opening to play as black. And I'll be completely honest, I'm not a fan of it, and I don't know if I'm going to be adding it to my repertoire anytime soon. So one of the reasons I'm really scared of this opening to play with the black pieces is, of course, if you look at some of the games where things went, very, very badly for black. One example is, of course, the so-called Cambridge Springs Immortal. And this was Capablanca. He played the move knight d2. We have bishop b4, queen c2. And then we had castles take place in that game. Bishop h4, c5. And a lot of these concepts are still kind of followed today. And notice Capablanca's just, very astute move, bishop to h4, just getting it out of the line of fire of this queen, but without exchanging it for the knight. And after knight b3, we have queen a4, which is, clever, because we've still got that pin. He exchanged, he took on c4, knight e4 got played, all these exchanges happened. But Alekhine isn't out of the woods. He's gotten a lot of pieces off the board, but he's still down a pawn right now, and he has to try to get that pawn back. And he hasn't really solved all of his opening problems. So like e takes d5, rook d5 takes. Notice he's down a pawn, and he still has to finish the development of his queenside, although here it's a little bit more clear how he's going to pull that off. So we have queen c6, rook d4, Capablanca gives up the pawn on g2 to finish his development. He plays bishop d3, queen g2, and then takes, bishop back to e4, queen back here, queen d2. But again, we haven't solved all the problems yet. We still have a bad piece, we still have pressure on b7, we still have this pin, and white's pieces are looking more and more active. When you play an opening like this against somebody like Capablanca, who's never going to put their pieces on unnatural squares, and never going to run out of finding ways to improve your position, you're really playing it against a very, very dangerous opponent. It's actually almost a miracle that Alekhine managed to beat Capablanca with the Cambridge Springs in a later attempt, which I think is just a testament to how good Alexander Alekhine was, especially after he experienced this defeat. So you have bishop e6, c4, and notice the pieces are just so strong. Everything is just attacking this king. It's just scary. And this is Alexander Alekhine is playing black. This isn't, some scrub that's playing black that's getting attacked like this. This is Alexander Alekhine. So if he's ending up in this position, I think it's really difficult for the rest of us. So Capablanca tears up all of the pieces, and Alekhine didn't have enough counterplay, so he says, okay, let me exchange queens, let me get some more of these pieces off the board. This turned out to be not a good decision, because it led to a pretty quick defeat. Capablanca exchanged the queens, played c5, and then the real issue is that he's basically getting mated down here. There's a huge threat against this king's back rank. So all these moves later, we still haven't solved all the problems. And after rook a7, Alekhine basically calls it quits. This is going to be it. This is going to be the end of it. So okay, so that's basically my treatise on the Cambridge Springs. Basically, it's a very dangerous opening to play with the black pieces. It's full of a lot of traps that people can fall into, and this makes it especially appealing for beginners. But as for whether or not I would recommend playing the Cambridge Springs with black, I really don't, unless you're a particular kind of player. If you have the technical skills, if you feel like your endgames are really, really strong, and you feel like your tactics and your technical skills are really strong, and really all you need to do is just solve your biggest opening problems to get out of the opening in one piece, it's basically an opening that's meant to circumvent somebody's opening preparation. And in that aspect, it does really good, and it's been a good weapon for a lot of very strong players for that reason. But as a positional opening and as a high-scoring opening for black, it is not. It's a specialty weapon that can be used by a few. Anyways, that's my opinion on the Cambridge Springs. I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.